All right, great. The clock has formally struck here, and so we are going to get started. Welcome to Lessons for Retiring Well, a conversation with Christine Benz of Morningstar about her new book, which is inclusive of 20 phenomenal lessons and really conversations with brilliant individuals about how to think about this stage of life. And appropriately, I see the chair of our Graham Council, Don Phillips, who also has quite an affiliation with Morningstar as its former CEO, holding the book with pride. I see a big smile. For those who want to also get it, we'll put in the chat how you can purchase the full book, which by the end of this conversation, I'm confident many of you will want to do. For those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, I'm just going to, let's see if I can proceed with my slides here. I'm going to move us forward. Is that slide turning on your screens? Yes? Okay, perfect. So we are the home of lifelong learning here at the Graham School. And apologies for the technological issues. There we go. I'm going to move us to this slide, which is that for more than 130 years, we have been trailblazing new paths in lifelong learning. This autumn, what that looks like is we welcomed our Leadership and Society Initiative's second class, 23 extraordinary individuals who want to design their next chapters of impact here at the university, selected from more than 350 candidacies from around the world. We welcomed our largest incoming class of Master of Liberal Arts students in more than a decade, 23 extraordinary individuals, again, who want to really study across all disciplines of the university. And you're noticing a trend. We welcomed our largest cohort of students in the basic program of liberal education since the 1950s. So there has never been a more exciting time to have long life learning, and we have many different ways for you to do that. If you are part of our community already, I just want to remind you, and my colleague Marina will put in the chat, we are right now accepting nominations for Outstanding Instructor Awards. Those will be given out in December at our holiday party. And you can join us for that holiday party at the Gleacher Center in downtown. Finally, this is one of many events that we are doing on both the Life of the Mind and on Long Life Learning. And you can see in front of you the many opportunities coming up to continue the journey that we will start today. But let me take down my screen because we are here to have a conversation with Christine Benz, and we are really grateful for the opportunity to do so. Christine is the Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning at Morningstar, and prior to that was a leader in mutual fund analysis and an editor of their journals. And Christine, maybe I can start the conversation by talking about your decision to move fully into retirement planning and kind of what inspired you to have this interest in retirement, and then what led you to write this book.
Sure. And first of all, Seth, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm thrilled to see such a big turnout. I'm thrilled to see my longtime colleague and mentor, Don Phillips, here as well. And so in terms of my own journey to focus on retirement planning, it was very much influenced by getting out, speaking to groups of investors, many of them who were transitioning into retirement, and hearing that there was just a lot of confusion about how to do retirement decumulation. So my initial interest in the topic was very much in the realm of, well, how do you construct a portfolio, an investment portfolio to supply you with your cash flows for retirement? And at the time I went down the road, we were in this era of what were becoming very low, safe interest rates on safe securities. And so what I was noticing and hearing was that people were assembling some very risky portfolios in the name of generating the type of income that they wanted to have in retirement. And so that was my initial impulse to travel down this road to learn more about how should people go about constructing a portfolio for retirement. And then as I traveled down that path, I realized that my focus had probably been too narrow, or definitely had been too narrow, and that I had been focusing on retirement planning as kind of a math problem, that I had been focusing exclusively on the financial piece of retirement, which of course is important. You need to have the funds to be able to retire. But then there are all these other dimensions, which I found fascinating having in conversations that I was having with actual retirees, as well as people who are retirement thought leaders. And so I realized what a rich vein this is, that there are so many different directions you can go in. You have other financial considerations like long-term care, how to pay for it, logistically, how to do long-term care if you need it, where to go for those resources, and then all of the really important non-financial aspects, like making sure that you have purpose later in life, making sure that you have strong relationships, all of those really interesting topics that I was able to explore in the book. So it has been a really interesting area. It's kept me alert and it's kept me learning, which I really love as part of my job on an ongoing basis.
Well, and it set you up for your own future. So great combination. So before we jump into the lessons, I want to set the table on what is challenging about this stage, because many of us picture, pina coladas and the resort. And so you'd say, what lessons do I need? But in truth, this is a very tough moment. I mean, when we think about retirement, we are also thinking about moving away often from things that give us great meaning. Right? In your book, you talk about how work can give you a source of identity. It can give you a source of purpose. It can give you a community of people around you that are really meaningful. So can you talk a little bit about the challenge of this stage? And then we'll come around to the lessons on how to both overcome those and thrive. But I feel like we should set the table with just why this is difficult before jumping into how you approach it.
Yeah, I talked to Laura Carstensen in the book. She's one of my favorite researchers. She is the head of the Stanford Center on Longevity, and she talks about the relationship piece and purpose to some extent. And she makes the point that work is good for us, actually. There's a lot about work that helps us find satisfaction. And you ticked off some of the key ones, Seth, purpose, relationships. And so when people do that hard stop without thinking about how they'll backfill some of those areas, they can struggle with the transition. And so the key is to think about the things that you derive from work. And if you're lucky, you'll be getting a lot of those points that you just referenced. But it's really wise as you move into retirement to think about where you will go for those things once you leave work. And it may cause you to work longer, or maybe transition into work gradually in order to hang on to some of those things longer. One thing that came up on several occasions and several conversations in the book is the change in relationships that can accompany moving away from work, and that men oftentimes derive a big share of their social networks from their interactions through their professions. And of course, that's a huge generalization. Many men have a lot of friends outside of work, but the data actually support that men sometimes struggle with this relationship piece as they move into retirement. So it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we are nurturing those relationships, finding new relationships if we have a lot of relationships coming through our workplace. And the same goes for purpose and identity. The identity piece is interesting. I think we often think about people with high status professions, that those are ones that are particularly difficult to walk away from. But all of us probably derive some sense of an identity from work, that this is what I do. This is who I am. And I think that's an argument for trying to keep that alive longer if you possibly can. So if you are a physician, for example, can you volunteer in some fashion even after you're officially retired? Or if you're someone like me who has focused on financial education, can you continue to do that either in an employment context or in a volunteer context for longer? So doing a little brainstorming as retirement approaches, I think, can be a super healthy thing to do.
Well, and what's so interesting is we were designing this Leadership and Society initiative here at the university and talking with a lot of our faculty about how do you think about this stage of life? And to a person, individuals were saying, well, I'll just keep teaching and, I'll just off ramp a little bit slowly and gradually. And there are aspects here in the academy that allow you to do that. And so many people are faculty into their 80s. And, I think that one of the things we talked with them about is, in a lot of professions, you don't have that opportunity at the same level for off-ramping. But boy, when you do, and I see it here, it really allows you to mix these pieces in a way that can be very generative. So you hold on to some of those values that are so core to the meaning, while also many people are looking for a little bit less of that work or a little bit different of that responsibility as they reach into this moment. And I want to come to that idea because I think one of the lessons that I really took away from the book is this idea of a phased approach. That, when we often think about it in popular culture, we say, okay, you learn, you earn, and then you retire, right? And these are each phases that you are in. And we think of this as just a big bucket. But just as our career has many chapters and phases and iterations, so too might retirement have many phases. And thinking about it in phases rather than as one, giant and singular moment is more helpful. And so can we start there and then we'll go through some of the other non-financial lessons in the book. I'll just acknowledge in advance that we don't see the Graham School as necessarily the leader on financial management. And so we're going to dig in especially to where you're focused on the life lessons that come out for people at this stage of life.
Sure. I love that question about phases. And I love to hear the example that it sounds like a lot of your faculty members have set where they are continuing to hang on to the parts of their jobs that they enjoy and doing them longer. I will say that it's a little bit of a luxury good, the ability to do that. In fact, there's a professor at University of Wisconsin, Anita Mukherjee, who has done some great research on this topic about more affluent, better educated people tend to have more leeway to continue working longer. They probably have jobs that aren't physically challenging, and they are able to continue working longer. Somewhat perversely, they need the money less, actually, too. So it's interesting when you look at the data on that. But I am fully supportive of the idea of phasing into retirement for people who are able to do that. And ideally, you would start kind of the ideation process well before you've retired. So you might start, say, 5 to 10 years into retirement, thinking about the parts of your job that you really enjoy, where you see them on your calendar in the coming week and you go, yes, that's going to be a good day. And then we all have that Sunday night moment where we look at our calendar and see a few things that kind of make our heart sink a little bit. Can you start to engineer your position in that direction where you're putting more weight and more time on the activities that you really enjoy? I will say this has been a little bit of a stealth mission of mine over the past several years, where it has been my goal to try to shed some of the things I don't love as much and just have my days filled with things that I really do enjoy. So I think to begin that discovery process well before you're close to retirement is a great strategy. So you're coming into the era when you might retire, but you're doing more things that you like. And then you can fool around with time, with your schedule a little bit as well. I think sometimes when people hear phased retirement, they think about it quite literally, like, oh, I'll go to 30 hours and then to 20 hours. Well, maybe that's part of it, because 40 hours is a lot of time to give to an employer each week. So perhaps you phase in terms of the number of hours. But being really quite gradual, I think, is the way to go as you think about retirement, and to think about hanging on to some of those things you really enjoy about your job longer. And I would also say it doesn't have to be with your employer or even with the type of position that you've had. So an example is, I've got a close friend who was a very high-ranking executive at a corporation here in the Chicago area. And she's a leader, but she is as burned out from the corporate world, but she needs to lead something. And so that's very clear to me that yes, her retirement was the right thing for her, but she continues to need to lead people because that is fully who she is. So sometimes the right answer isn't to stick with your employer or to even stick with your position, but can you stick with those things that really make you you in some other context? To me, that's a really good way to look at it. And then kind of thinking about the harder phases, we've been talking about the early happy phases of retirement where you're continuing to work at things that give you joy and purpose. I also think it's valuable to look forward to the later phases of retirement. And we all have examples from our lives of older adults who have done this successfully, who have gotten ahead of some of the challenges that life inevitably presents, that aging presents. But to try to put yourself in the driver's seat, to be realistic about how you will change, how the home that maybe was a good fit for you when you were younger might not make sense as you age with a bunch of stairs and a bunch of rooms to clean or whatever the case might be, but to really try to think ahead to the later stages of your life to help make sure that the decisions that you're making are in line with what your values are. I think that someone makes the point in the book, and I can't remember who it is that you don't really want to put your children or your loved ones in the difficult position of making these decisions for you. You want to be super clear about what you want, what your vision is, if you need care, what type of setting you would want that care delivered, all those harder sorts of things. It's not as happy a phase of retirement, but I think it's super helpful to give some thought to what that might look like and use successful examples from your life, as well as perhaps some less successful examples to inform some of the decision making that you do.
Well, and I'll just say, Christine, because we had this conversation recently with John Leland, who's a New York Times reporter, and he wrote a book, Happiness is a Choice We Make. His book looks at people over 85, and the 6 people that he goes deeply into the lives of need some of these extra long-term care. And one piece in his book is that these individuals, even though they have all these needs, are actually at one of the happiest moments of their life, both according to the survey data quantitatively and also in his own individual reporting. And so it kind of baffles our minds, I think, because, he talks about how when he looked at these individuals, he would think, with all of the ailments in their, in this case, late 80s and 90s, they may not have that kind of joy. And yet, for a variety of reasons that he goes through, it actually is one of the most joyous periods because people kind of shed expectations. And then, what he said is many of these individuals, they wake up every day just amazed they have another day. And so it was remarkable to me as we talked about this, that stage, which again, we many times don't even want to think about because when we're looking forward, we say, oh, we'll put that off. I don't want to contend. That was really interesting. And just for myself, reshaping my own frame of that time. I want to come into this idea of purpose that's core to what you've described, because, I've thought of purpose mainly in the positive sense that, you want this thing to motivate you and you want to wake up every day with that idea of what you're accomplishing. But you're not only describing it as really valuable in that positive sense, but you also have, I think, a really insightful idea of the vacation and that it's specifically meaningful for people because it is a vacation after you've accomplished it and earned it. And that many people, they think, oh, that vacation that I enjoyed for a week, well, now I get to do that forever. But once you are doing it all the time, it has very different meaning. And so you use purpose in the book in 2 ways. You use it both as a motivational source, but also as a source that gives comfort to everything else. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about one, how you think about purpose at this stage, and then 2, how you've seen people find it. Because especially for people where they're overwhelmingly focused on their work or maybe their work and their family, but now both have kind of moved on because their kids have grown up and their work is complete, at least in its original form. How do you find it? So what is it and how do you find it?
Yeah, Jordan Grummett does a wonderful job of discussing purpose in the book. He talks about big P purpose. So those would be like some of the really aspirational things that if we think about what we might want to accomplish during our retirement years, we might have something really lofty that we want to accomplish. So maybe it's starting a foundation to address some need in our community, or climbing a mountain, or writing a book, or whatever the case might be. He calls that big P purpose. So those are really aspirational things. He makes the point, though, that that type of purpose gives people a lot of purpose anxiety, that people are like, I'm not sure. I know I should be doing something really big with this free time that I have in retirement. So people are stymied a little bit as they're trying to think through what that big P purpose might be. So what point he made, which I found very comforting, which was that focus on small P purpose just as a starting point. Are there things like being a great partner to your spouse, or being a wonderful parent or grandparent, or getting back to that hobby that you used to love when you were a child that you just kind of had to set aside because you got busy, or whatever the case might be? Let's start with some small P purposes. And his point, I thought, was very comforting, was that a suite of those small P purposes, that's just fine too. And it may spark some ideas about big P purpose, but the small P purpose, this idea that, oh, dad loved to garden, or mom loved to go to the opera and, was a big supporter of the opera, or whatever it might be. Those are the things that our loved ones will remember about us, and they don't have to be these giant accomplishments. Maybe you do those things, and that's lovely too, but a group of those small P purposes is just fine too. So I found that to be a really comforting point. I also liked Michael Finke's discussion, which I think is what you're referencing, Seth, about this idea of not just embarking on retirement as a long vacation, but actually building in things that you're going to relax from. And the point is balance, right? That balance is so important to every aspect of life. And when we think about our most successful vacations when we're working, or the ones that just felt the best, they were often the ones where we had been working really hard, and then we came into that vacation and it just felt so good. Well, his point is that you should try to build a little bit of that into every day, that you need something to relax from. And he made a point to me, I think it's not in the book, but it was so funny to me. He said, if I told you tomorrow that your job had to be chasing around a white ball with a stick on in a park every day, you would probably say, hey, forget it, I don't want to do that. But his point is that that if you don't have kind of that balance, that thing that feels like a leisure activity, golf might start to feel like kind of a job. So I think balance is a really valuable thing to bring into retirement too.
Well, and there's another concept that just came up on the podcast that you host, The Long View. You had a conversation with someone who has a terminal illness. They know they're going to be dying. It was an incredibly powerful and enriching conversation because he had such a positive outlook on it all. But one of the examples in there that I thought tied a lot to the contents of your book is that he is actually doing a renovation on his home. And he knows he will not have a chance to likely live in the home. Now, his wife will in this case. But what he said is that he did not even bat an eye about whether he was going to complete this huge renovation as he got this news, because for him, he is actually excited about the progress. So he never really pictured the renovation being about living in the home. The renovation was about getting the home to this point because he's someone who himself is so motivated by progress. And it may have just been that I feel very similar to the way he described, like wanting to wake up every day and feel progress independently of the outcome, just feel that forward movement. But anyway, I thought that idea as an example of purpose, that really struck me, especially in this case where the purpose was not even to be enjoyed, but it was to have that experience of learning, doing, acting, and kind of being in this relationship with the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I loved that part too, Seth, where Jonathan Clements, who was a longtime personal finance columnist for the Wall Street Journal and now has a blog called Humble Dollar, is grappling with a devastating cancer diagnosis. He's not not an old person. He's, I believe, 62. And so he does talk about in this interview that we had about that idea of wanting to go down this road, knowing that it would be expensive and messy, but also knowing that observing progress is a big component of being human. And his other point was in terms of how he wants to spend his time, which is he expects it'll be shorter than he had originally thought. He made the point that he was just going to keep doing the main things he always did, which is doing a job he loves and spending time with people he loves. And that's his quality of life. It was an incredibly moving interview. He made the point that we don't hear enough from the dying. And it's very true that often people are too infirm to really tell us what they're thinking and feeling. And so I find it so inspiring that Jonathan's taking this time, taking this diagnosis to share his experiences with all of us. And it inspires me to live a little bit better, to do a little bit better with everything that I'm working on. And I hope people who listen to it will feel the same.
Well, I definitely felt that way. So an N of one, but I was deeply touched by it. You are kind of through with this book, through all the interviews. What's the biggest surprise? What was the thing you didn't expect to find that maybe changed your view of retirement?
So my glib answer is that I was surprised at how difficult it is to take interviews with really smart people and make them into something that is really readable. But the one of the most surprising aspects was the role of housing and community later in life. And I believe Michael Finka made this point as well, that people in community settings in their people are happiest in their homes sort of through their 70s, but then when they sample happiness and satisfaction later in life, people who are in some type of community setting, whether it's in an apartment building where you're in regular contact with other people, or you're in some sort of institutional long-term care setting, they tend to be happier than people who are in their homes. And there's this kind of long-standing thought that, oh, everyone naturally wants to age in place, and aging in place in your home is naturally the way to do it if you can afford to do it. So I would say that that was kind of a surprise for me and got me thinking about that whole life stage, that maybe encouraging people to stay in place in their homes with care is maybe not the right way to go about it. And of course, it's a very personal decision, but that was a somewhat surprising finding. And I like the whole conversation that we had on housing in general, that Mark Miller, who's a Morningstar contributor, made the point that aging in place means aging kind of in your community, but don't be so literal about it that it has to be in the home in which, I've been living for the past 20 or 30 years or more. That as long as you can keep your friends and family network close, as long as you can keep your healthcare providers and the cultural activities you enjoy close, that's the main thing. Don't focus so much on the physical plant. So I thought that was an interesting dimension of this.
We're going to come to audience questions in a moment, so let me just encourage anyone who has them, use the chat function. Please chime in with your questions. Rosine, we've kind of referenced this, but I want to ask directly, how has this influenced your own retirement planning? Like, what has this meant for you individually in terms of how you've thought about the next stage?
Yeah, I have thought more about this phased retirement idea, and I have been really tackling it in terms of my own work life. I referenced that I've tried to change up my activities a little bit over the past several years. So that's one dimension. I do think that I'm going to be someone who grapples with what we've been shorthanding on our team is kind of the permission to spend problem. So that the book does have a lot of financial content. And one of the things that I've discovered in talking to retired people, especially those who have been savers and investors throughout their lives, is that switching to actually spending from your portfolio, it doesn't feel great. This idea that yes, maybe your portfolio will grow, but this idea that, oh, I may be spending from a finite resource. That is something that I think I'll struggle with. So I've been exploring in my writing different ways to help people over that hump where they're actually spending appropriately. So that has changed my thinking. It's made me think that it's something I need to get ahead of and also need to write more about. Um, and then I've come to be a big believer in lifetime giving versus necessarily focusing on leaving an inheritance. So that is something that has influenced my own thinking about how I'll manage my financial assets. I would like to see my money work for my loved ones during my lifetime. And so my husband and I plan to build that into our plan as well.
My final question before I turn over, even though we are mainly covering the non-financial lessons, are there any other kind of highlights from the financial lessons that, I mean, we care about wellness for our community that you just think are really important to have on their dashboard of how to think about this phase?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that research that comes out in the book and a lot of other places does point to the value of guaranteed income. So non-portfolio income, you have your investments and that's fine. But to the extent that you can enlarge that non-portfolio income, whether it's by delaying Social Security or perhaps purchasing some sort of very basic annuity type to help augment Social Security. What the research shows is that people who have more of that income in place are just happier overall with their financial lives. They're more at peace with the fluctuations that will inevitably happen with their investment portfolios. So I think that's a good takeaway, to focus on enlarging your lifetime income. If you're lucky enough to have a pension of some kind, of course, that's a really good position to be in. And then also, we talk about how people have different retirement income styles. Dr. Wade Pfau does a discussion about this, and he has this wonderful sort of questionnaire that people can take to help determine how they're geared, because we all are a little bit different in terms of how much variability we're willing to tolerate in terms of our portfolio cash flows. So I would urge people to take his questionnaire. We've got a link to it in the book to find out where they land. And finally, all the research about retirement spending and safe portfolio spending rates in retirement. People may have heard about the 4% guideline. The research from our team and other entities very much points to the value of, if you can vary your withdrawals from your portfolio a little bit based on what's going on in your portfolio. So take less if your portfolio's down. You should be able to take a little bit more if it's enjoyed nice gains. Just be a little bit flexible. Don't be dogmatic about taking the same amount out year after year. That redounds to the benefit of larger lifetime withdrawals. So I think that's another thing that people can bear in mind as they're thinking about the financial piece of retirement.
How do you think, Christine, that your book might be different today because people are living longer reliably than if it were written a generation or two ago? How has longevity basically shaped the way that you're thinking about and the people you're talking with are thinking about this stage?
Longevity is a huge dimension of this. So we typically, when we're talking about retirement planning horizons, we typically are looking at a 30-year horizon at a minimum. And of course, it may not be that long, but for married couples, I think there's something like a 1 in 3 chance that one of those partners will make it to age 95. So it's definitely a force to be reckoned with, which gets back to the point I just made about enlarging lifetime income sources, non-portfolio income sources. If you're concerned about longevity, making sure that you are taking maximum advantage of those lifetime income sources. It's just a huge dimension of this. And of course, it compounds the challenge. If you think you'll be retired for roughly as long as you worked, it means that you need to be more conservative in terms of how you are withdrawing from that portfolio. But it also means that you adjust along the way as you get more information about your health, and your own longevity, that potentially it might affect how you manage your own plan.
We have a question here from Scott. What additional areas of retirement would you address if you could have explored more than 20 topics? So were there some cuts from the book that, you feel would actually be really valuable for us to be thinking about?
A couple of key areas. I love that question. One is how to find financial advice, because a key takeaway for me, and I should have just mentioned it when we were talking about financial things to have on your dashboard. I have been a big believer in the fact that some investors can do just fine as DIY type investors in the accumulation phase. The retirement planning, the retirement decumulation phase is inherently just much more complicated. I'm very much a believer in people getting some professional advice at this stage. It's a topic we just kind of touched on very lightly, how to find a good quality financial advisor, but I wish we had a chapter in there about how to do that, because there are definitely some things you need to know as you go down that road. And then I also wish we had had room to discuss the financial independence, retire early movement in some fashion. I think, unfortunately, some people in the traditional retirement planning community are too dismissive of the FIRE community. I have been so inspired by some of the individuals in the FIRE movement, mainly because they are so keenly attuned to maximizing their time on Earth allocations. So they definitely know that they want to try to save hard early and work hard, but they also are very much attuned to, well, how do I maximize this precious life that I have? So I would have loved to include a chapter about FIRE, because I've just met so many terrific people in that community.
And it's really interesting, Christine, as you mentioned, the need potentially for a different type of financial advice at this stage. What you're describing, which is often the case in life, is that you build up habits, and then it's very hard to overcome them when they're no longer the goal set, right? So when we think about our goal at this stage in my mid 40s, my goal is to see my portfolio go up every month, right? And accumulation is a relatively straightforward goal. There's diversification, but my goal is to get that number bigger, right? So then what is it like when you enter a stage where you might actually have a goal of having that portfolio go down rather than just be left at the end? And what is it like when you may have many goals for how that portfolio is dispersed or used, right? That's very different than the, role where I just wanted to get bigger every month and maximize. And so it's really interesting being in that DIY camp to think about, oh, but this is a stage much more complex where you might have a totally different need set than you ever anticipated. And how do you overcome all of these built-in habits that you've really normalized over time as the way you think about progress? And so just a great example, I think, of how that changes. And if we're not conscious of it, it can be easy that we take that mindset all the way through when it's no longer actually fulfilling its original purpose.
Exactly. And I think a financial advisor could serve such a valuable role there to help you spend in line with your values. A good advisor will have some goals discovery conversation with you. The goal in retirement is not to amorphously continue to accumulate assets. And a good advisor can earn his or her fees many times over, I think, by having discussions like that, by helping you with the tax planning dimension of decumulation, because here again, it's pretty straightforward when you're in the accumulation phase. Take advantage of those tax sheltered vehicles that you have available to you. You have some guardrails around you when you're in accumulation phase. You have a really great straightforward option in a target date mutual fund, which are available through company or employer provided retirement plans. There's no analog for that in retirement decumulation, in part because it's just inherently more complicated. We don't know how much someone's spending. We don't know what their goals are, but there just isn't that good set of guardrails for retirement decumulators that we have for people in the accumulation phase. And frankly, there's a lot that's substandard about how we handle retirement decumulation in this country, in that we now, with the defined contribution sort of mindset, 401k, 403b, et cetera, we give people their pot of money that they've saved their whole life, at a life stage where they may have no training in how to manage that portfolio. They have no training in how to spend from it. We know that the incidence of cognitive decline increases as people age. So there's a lot about how we're doing it that is not great.
So I want to read a comment from Denny. We all want to continue to make a difference in retirement. One of the best ways to do that is to be a mentor and to share acquired wisdom with motivated and talented young people. Also great to work in a pro bono status to both teach and learn. Can you talk a little bit about two ideas that are embedded in Denny's comment? One is intergenerationality.
Mm.
What is the value of it? It comes up a few times in different ways. How do you build intergenerational relationships at this stage? And then a second piece, which is around how you share back. What are the different ways? I think it's very common among, and maybe there's a luxury good to your point earlier, and that is a lot of the audience we likely have, people that are educated and that are thinking about how to pay forward. How do they think about the teaching, sharing of the gifts that they've built up over time at this stage?
Yeah, two really great components to that question. So the intergenerationality, you're right. It came up in several discussions in the book. Laura Carstensen talks about how diversification is a good model for our investment portfolio, but it's also a great model for our friends network, where
Yeah.
if you can try to diversify across age bands, ideally try to keep that going while you're working. So I love the idea of reverse mentoring. I have a colleague who is quite a bit younger than me. I help her, I hope, with her career and some of her goals, but she certainly helps me with figuring out the latest and greatest technology developments that we have going on at work, with helping me leverage my content across multiple channels. So ideally, you would start that earlier. One person who I think is so strong on this topic is Mark Friedman. He's not in the book, but I love his work. He calls it actually age apartheid in this country, that we tend to be so self-segregated by age bands, and we need to try to be creative about breaking out of that. And ideally, you should start that earlier while you're still working. I think there are also risks to putting yourself in a setting where you will be engaging exclusively with people who are your same age. So that's kind of my reservation about some of these communities that are geared explicitly toward older adults. I know that people oftentimes are very happy in those communities, but you do need to make a plan to get yourself out of that community where you can get exposed to people of different age bands. It's just good for us to diversify our friends network. In terms of leveraging our expertise to kind of pay it forward or just make a difference in our communities, I love the idea of either, trying to hang on to a piece of your work that you really enjoyed, where you felt like that was very much a part of that work activity, or consider volunteer activities that leverage your work. So in my own life, I'm involved in what's called the John C. Bogle Center for Financial Literacy. It's my volunteer activity, my main volunteer activity, that happens to be perfectly aligned with my work activity. And my thought is that for many people, there is probably some way to do that. So if your career path was accountancy, for example, well, my guess is that your favorite charity or your church or whatever the case might be, they probably need some help on the accounting front as well. So do a little bit of brainstorming about how to use that expertise and how to make sure that you're sharing it with your community and with the next generation.
We have one final question we'll get to now, and they are asking about something that you do address in the book, your bucket approach.
Mm.
Can you give just the kind of power round, the 30 to 60-second version of that approach?
Sure. So this is a strategy for structuring an in-retirement portfolio, but the basic idea is that you are organizing that portfolio by your anticipated spending from it. So for your first couple of years of retirement, you'd want to have maybe 2 years worth of liquid reserves set aside in just cash investments, no growth potential, but also no volatility. And then you just step out on the risk spectrum from there. And I think it's a kind of a mental accounting strategy that helps people back into a situation appropriate asset allocation, a composition of the portfolio, and that uses what we know about how various asset classes perform to inform how much you hold in each of those asset classes. So we know that stocks over time horizons of like 10 years or longer have been extraordinarily reliable, actually. But when you shrink that time horizon to 3 years or 5 years, you'd want to have safer assets. You wouldn't want to have to be pulling from stocks. So that's the basic thought process in this bucket strategy. I've got a lot of bucket portfolios on Morningstar.com that are just there for educational purposes if people want to read more. But I always credit a financial planner and a professor of financial planning. I know Harold Ovensky, who originally put the bug in my ear, and it just makes sense to me. And I think intuitively, it helps people keep peace with the long-term portion of their portfolios.
Well, Christine, this has been a fascinating conversation. We did intend it to be really focused on the non-financial. Since a few times finance came up, I just want to say as a disclaimer that the Graham School does not have deep knowledge in this area and encourages everyone to, be thoughtful and certainly get independent advice and not trust us as a source on that particular topic. The place where we have great focus and interest, which you also spoke brilliantly about, is the real value of purpose, learning, and joy, if I can use that word, at this stage of life. And I know that many will find that in your book, and that we are very grateful as we read it to see so many ways in which the lifelong community that we curate here is really involved in many of the best practices that you describe on that non-financial side. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for your contribution to this field. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Seth. Thanks, everyone.